Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining us. In the last video, we were repairing a pool pump. Today, we complete the wiring for that three-phase, 7.5 horsepower motor. While replacing the motor, we found that some of the wiring was cracked. So to avoid future service issues, we are replacing all three line wires as well as the ground, which had been undersized. We are also replacing the flex conduit and fittings while everything is pulled apart. Here you see a current sensor for the motor controller. Line 1 runs through the middle of the sensor, which sends an alert if the current is too high. This can be caused by a seized motor and could result in equipment damage, fire, or worse. We will be sure to run our new L1 through this sensor. So I'm going to get these wires out of here. I can just cut them loose and pull the old flex conduit off, and then I'm going to rip the wires back up through the box because it's easier to make sure I don't damage anything ripping things through if I was to pull them the other way. Now, while we get this ready, we're going to run new 8-gauge stranded wire for the power, as well as an 8-gauge stranded wire for the ground. The old ground wire was a 14-gauge solid wire, and solid or stranded, either one is fine, but it was too small. The requirements by the National Electric Code are that the ground wire needs to be at least 14 gauge, I believe, 12 or 14 gauge, but it cannot be smaller than the power supply wires. So here we are pushing these 8-gauge stranded wires back out through the bottom, and we'll go ahead and grip them, pull them out, and that'll make it easier for us to get the last two wires, one of the power wires and the ground wire. Now, this 7.5 horsepower motor is running on three-phase 230-volt power. So that's why it has three power wires. And they're actually going to be wired in a Y configuration. So those motor windings come in a Y configuration or a delta configuration. And most motors that you're going to run into for pools are going to be a Y configuration, but you always need to check the motor plate, the nameplate on the motor, and make sure that you're wiring it properly because they can come in delta configuration as well. So here we are connecting our wires in the controller. We're going to get our ground wire secured up on the ground lug first. And then once we've got that secured, we'll run our line 1 through that current sensor that we talked about earlier. And then we'll secure all three line wires to the bottom of the contactor, which is controlled by the motor controller. Now you can see we have our line 3, 2, and 1 all connected to the contactor. Line 1 is running through that current sensor. And then our ground wire is run up along the top to the grounding lug. So that current sensor is going to make sure that if the motor seizes or there's some other power problem, that the motor does not catch fire. So we are now ready to get our flex conduit in and wire the motor. But before we do, a quick word from this week's imaginary sponsor. Sabra. Yum. All right, so we've measured the distance we need for our flexible conduit, And we're now going to get it on the wires and get the connectors hooked up to it and get it run over to the motor. So we'll have power into the motor and it'll all be liquid tight, so we won't have to worry about rain intrusion or minor splash up or anything like that, getting water into this box for the power for the motor. We can also see Richard is getting the final touches on tightening up those housing bolts for the EQ series pump. And now it's time to get this wiring done. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 hot wires and a ground wire. Now, this is not a 4-wire 3-phase system. A 4-wire 3-phase system would have 3 hots, a neutral, and then a 5th ground. This does not have that neutral, so it is a 3-wire 3-phase system. Coming out of the motor, I have 9 leads, which correspond to the different windings. Because this is a low voltage wiring setup, I will first connect T's 4, 5, and 6 together, as you can see them off to your right-hand side. I'm then going to separate out T1 and T7 to connect to line 1. I'm going to separate out T2 and T8 to wire to line 2, and then T3 and T9 will be separated out to connect to line 3. Each of these wires is color-coded and labeled, so it makes it very simple to wire if you have any experience doing electrical work. Always refer to the motor nameplate on the motor you're wiring to confirm that you've wired it properly. I like to separate out the wires and get them all untangled first. It makes it a little bit easier to get them put together, and then I'm going to put them in a clockwise rotation into the box and secure the screws, making sure that the gasket's in place so we have a watertight seal. That's it for this repair. I hope you found it informative, and if so, consider subscribing for future content like it. If you liked this video, give us a thumbs up, and we'd greatly appreciate it.